Hello and welcome to the Merri-Cast, the show that puts you on the fast track to confidence in starting and growing your business. My guest this week is Charles Skinner. Charles is CEO of Restore plc, but he's also much more besides that. In a former life, Charles was editor of Management Today magazine, and actually he was the one that gave me my first proper job in journalism about 30 years ago. Charles was a great boss, although suddenly he just disappeared. He went off one day into the corporate world to become a CEO, which wasn't the usual destination from wordsmiths like me and others around. His journey since then has been captured in his excellent book, Buy, Run, Build, A Guide to Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition. Now, Charles says that starting a business is stressful, time-consuming, and often ends in failure. But buy into a business, known as an acquisition to you and me, is becoming a popular alternative. And so this show is going to focus on that as a way of starting to scale your business. Now, as always, I asked Charles what he wanted to do early on in his career, and he was already ready for me with his first answer.
Well, I won't plug the book immediately, but the first chapter is called What Do You Want to Do? And it partially reflects the fact that it took me 15 years and 5 jobs to work out what I wanted to do. And it was pretty curious because I left university and went to work for S.G. Warburg, which was what was then called a merchant bank, but would nowadays be called an investment bank. And I was really pretty poor at it. And I actually left and went to work in a pub. Then I joined a very small private equity firm, which was investing in very early stage oil. And then probably had my most formative experience. That got taken over. The people advising on that deal were 3i. So I worked for 7 years at 3i Corporate Finance, advising private companies and public companies, but mainly on M&A. And then, as you'll remember, I made a rather curious leap and became editor of Management Today. And then through a lot of luck, I ended up just after that going off to run a quoted company, which I'd been close to the quoted company before. I was been a non-exec director for 3 years. And I suppose if you look at that, it seems really odd, but actually what I was discovering was, first of all, I was much more interested in business than finance. Then I learned that actually I was more interested in small businesses than big businesses. And then I learned that it was nice to be an advisor, as I was at 3i. It was nice to be a commentator, as it was at Management Today, but something big was missing. And I was very fortunate that probably my first job in industry was the CEO of a quoted company, which came about from contacts I'd made. Somebody came to me whose business I sold, and he said, I'm bored, as happens quite a lot. So we found a small business in Bristol, which happened to be quoted, and then I went on the board of that business. And that started to grow quite fast. And then the chief executive, who put up most of the money, said, Charles, you seem to have so many strong opinions. Why don't you come and run it?
Now, I should tell the listeners that you gave me my first job in proper journalism. I'd worked at the Economist Intelligence Unit before that, but what I regard as a proper job. And I'm convinced you probably gave me that job because I, like you, I didn't have very much experience in journalism at that time, and it was great. But when I observed you at that time, I just saw you sort of absorbing loads of stuff around sort of leadership and management, even if it was a bit of a ziggy-zaggy kind of route. I mean, was that, once you were there in the editor's chair, I mean, did you think this is all going to be useful stuff, for later on, or was that not in your mind at that point?
I hadn't really worked out what I wanted to do at that point. It was just very nice to be an editor of a business magazine. And there were a lot of nice things which happened. I used to host a lunch at Claridge's, and you'd ring up all the sort of big hitters and say, do you want to come for lunch at Claridge's? And you'd sit there with James Hansen or with Lord Hollick or all of these people, and you'd sit and chat with them. You also occasionally would have gurus coming to town, or Tom Peters, and because we used to pretend, as you remember well, that our main competitor was The Economist, but it wasn't really. But they would want to see you, and I had the opportunity to interview Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and with Campbell in the background and things. So I loved that, being exposed to really interesting people of whatever scale. But I also enjoyed the pieces we used to run on small companies and how they got going. Where actually, as you know about small companies, it's generally about the people. That was really good fun, and I was able to get people like Terry Smith to write for us, who now runs Fundsmith. So it was a lot of fun, but I still had this frustration that I'm on the sidelines rather than actually doing stuff. So it took me till I was 37 to actually land in a position which, for better for worse, I do really enjoy running companies, although in the book there's a thing about what happens when it all goes wrong, and by God has it gone wrong. And also this book was at one point called Failure is My Friend, because everything I really learned was when I got things wrong.
Okay, and I mean, this process then of you getting things wrong, if you like, as you very modestly put it, that then you were there one day, a management day, the next minute you were gone, you were suddenly CEO. I mean, just tell us about the company that you found yourself in, and did it go right or wrong at the start? What kind of pains or pleasures did you go through during those early years?
It was pretty tough. That John, who was the chairman, he'd run a lot of smaller businesses, probably, and we started buying tool hire companies in the West Country. And then I think he felt that as it got bigger, he needed somebody else who probably had lunch with the big cheeses, who'd worked in the cities, things like that. So I came in there. There was a bit of sorting out. We were a hire business, so we had bouncy castles, fancy dress. So it's all about focus and going, no, let's make this a very simple narrative for everybody. Our job is to have a tool hire in the areas where we operate, which ended up being completely national, have a tool hire shop within half an hour of most major conurbations, but we would focus on return on invested capital. And what we would do, our heroes were always the branch managers, and we would make their life as easy as possible. So all the stuff, whether it's sort of PAYE, complex HR issues, they didn't have to worry about that at all. They had to worry about looking after the customers and the kit. And that went quite well, and it had been a sort of £3 or £4 million company knocking around on AIM. And we were incredibly lucky in 2006 that we ran out of ideas, so we sold it for over 100 million quid to Wolseley. And then and at that point, I thought, I'm a genius. I can take these small companies, I can build them. We started off with 80 people, we've now got over 1,000. And anyway, so that I was then out of work, and I was asked by the biggest shareholder of that company, Brandon Hire. He said, "Do you realise that Johnson Service Group has fired their CEO, and I'm the biggest shareholder there? I thought you were quite a good chap. Why don't you have a go at that?" Anyway, I thought, this is fantastic, 10,000 people, I'm on my way, I know everything, I'll sort this out in no time at all. Anyway, I play a lot of cards, particularly bridge, and I did very little due diligence. I then turned up and the whole thing stank. So how I describe it was I was dealt an appalling hand, and I played it abysmally, to the extent that when I joined, the shares were £3. On my arrival as this bright young CEO that went up to £3.60, I slunk out 8 months later with the shares at 20p. Now, you go through that process and you learn an awful lot. And then as the book starts off, I thought I was pretty unemployable. All my illusions about myself were shattered. My mental health was not in a great shape. I was trying to pay the school fees, and that was a tough time. And it actually gave me time to reflect on my failings. And actually, I started this book then as a form of catharsis, and also to work out what I got so wrong.
So you started the book how long ago then? When was that? What year?
2008. So 2007 was my Annus Horribilis.
Right.
And 2008, I started writing it. And then I came into the rather swimmy office that I'm sitting in now. This is as CEO of Restore PLC. And in 2009, I wrote to the biggest shareholder in a small quoted company and said, this thing is bust. Inside it, there is one really good business. And he said, you're quite right. I'm appointing a new chairman. If you get on with him, you can come and run it. And I remember it was a quoted company. My mother at the time, and the shares were quoted and they were 0.0027p or something. My mother, without telling me, was the only person who bought any shares, and I think she bought 5,000 or 10,000 quid's worth at what became 12p. And when the shares hit £6, she was terrified. in terms of how much money she'd made. So we had a year of hell here, getting out of bust businesses, trying to offload things, etc. But then by sort of September 2010, we got rid of all the rubbish. A few of the people who remembered me from the city started funding us, and we grew the business from, well, eventually at its peak, it was worth £600 million, having been worth £1 million. And the shares, the people who came in at 26p, the shares 6 or 7 years later were £5. And I'd done that through predominantly acquiring businesses in the records management sector. Along the way, we went into scanning, we went into shredding, we went into office moves, we went into IT recycling. And again, something like IT recycling and the office moves business, I kept on finding old IT equipment around the back when I was snooping around, seeing it was having a fag, and went, actually, we should be an IT recycling. So we bought a little business, probably out your way, arms of Bedfordshire. Yeah. And then we sat on it for 2 years while we worked out how the industry worked. And today we're the biggest IT recycler in the UK.
Right. Can I ask you a question, just to rewind a little bit? I mean, that period, I mean, where you sold the business, the previous business in 2006, you were thinking, I'm a genius. And then before you got involved in your Annus Horribilis thing there, I'm not sure whether this is when we had the conversation. I remember having a conversation with you, and you were saying that you'd spent some time off and you needed a hamster wheel, is what I think the phrase that you used at the time. I mean, a lot of people thinking, he sold up. Why did he ever go back? Why did he do that? Why didn't he just sort of, I mean, just tell me about this hamster wheel and why you needed it.
Well, it's, I mean, there's a story in the book about the sort of people I like buying businesses off. And the people I don't like buying businesses off are 40-year-olds, and I suppose I was 45 at the time, who have run their business brilliantly possibly from scratch. They've done it really well, and then they think, I want to go and play golf. And actually, I'm really wary of those transactions, because however much they think they want to play golf and never look at a widget factory again, actually 2 or 3 years later, they're going, well, I've got a bit of money, but possibly the money is dwindling a bit faster than they thought. But also they're going, what am I going to do? And generally what people do is they go, well, I do know a lot about widget manufacturing. Well, my non-compete clause is finished. I bet you nobody will mind if I set up a little widget factory. And actually all those nice blokes at the car companies that we supplied, they're still all my mates. And then you discover that if you bought that business, you discover that you sort of go, where are all our customers gone? Oh, well, Trevor set up again. So I think it was partly that, and I'd also enjoyed business, but it was very interesting. I was actually in Varanasi in India, sitting with my brother on the Ghats, when this big investor from Scotland rang me and said, "Do you fancy running Johnson Service Group?" And I thought, oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you went back and then did that. That didn't work out so well, but then you did Restore. And
that's a very nice way of putting it. It didn't work out very well.
So well. Yeah. Now, because I want people to go and buy the book, of course. So let's talk about the interweaving of the book and your life from sort of roughly Restore onwards. So Buy, Run, Build. Tell me a little bit about that. You've kind of alluded to it. I mean, about this kind of gestation period that there's been. But what do you want readers to come away with from the book? And just tell me a bit about the book and what you're trying to say with it.
I think people typically think of the entrepreneur as Steve Jobs in his garage, or the HP people and all the rest of this, and have a view that to be an entrepreneur, you start off at the kitchen table and then it gets bigger and bigger, and then you turn into one of those. And I've got a lot of mates, Johnny Bowden, Charlie Bigham, the White Company people, who have done that. And it's interesting that they're generally in the retail space, which again, I explain in the book why retail is a good business and you don't need capital for it. But actually, for a lot of people, whether they're doing their MBAs, whether they're middle managers, etc., it is really tough starting up. You haven't got any income. You don't know quite often you don't have a proven concept. You need a bit of money behind you, because you're not going to have food to put on the table because you're not earning anything. And actually, buying a small business, and I explain in the book how you can quite often do it for nothing, It's also easier to raise funding because I come to my friend Trevor and say, look, this business is making $500,000 a year. I've got some borrowing, I've got this, I've got the revenues, I've got the sales, the owner's a bit sleepy. I can pay your money back, and you'll look at it and go, yeah, you probably will actually. Whereas if I come to you and say, I've got a brilliant idea for an app, you'll find yourself forgetting that we ever worked together, and that was very nice. So I'm really keen on this area. And actually, if you look at great entrepreneurs, they've always bought businesses along the way. But I think this is particularly targeted at people who think they'd like to run a business, but how do they go about it? They have ideas. You need lots of money to buy a business, and it explains where the sweet spot is and things about how you go about it. And then it takes you through to, primarily steeped in my failures, how you actually run the business, and it even goes on to deal with how you deal with the city and things like that. And in fact, it was interesting because the book was knocking around, and a lady who runs some of the businesses I've invested in Tool Hire again, she had a look at the book and said, Charles, this is brilliant. Do you know what the biggest course is at Harvard at the moment? So, well, she was a Harvard MBA, brave thing to come into the Tool Hire business. And she said, this is entrepreneurship through acquisition, which is the biggest course at Harvard at the moment. So that sort of set off a light bulb, and I slightly swung it round from being called failure is my friend to being actually more slightly smugger, but I do beat myself up a lot, about a sort of guide to actually how you go about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the characteristics. I'm looking at some of the reviews now, which are all good. Charles Skinner is as frank as his disasters, he's modest about his triumphs, and so on. I mean, the very opposite of the boastful tech bro, says Martin van der Weyer of the Spectator. I mean, there's lots of really good people saying really good things about this book, and it's typical of your character that you're being very modest about it, but you've done pretty well, haven't you? I mean, 2009, you Restore, and then you were there for 10 years, I think, and then you went away for a bit and then came back. I mean, the journey of Restore though is a successful one, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's about, most of business is about luck and timing, and I happened to be that I'd identified storing bits of paper in cardboard boxes as a really good space, which had one huge operator and a very, very fragmented tail. And I could see that this was a great market to consolidate. And once I had the confidence of investors and done the first, got rid of all the rubbish in the business and just focused on this one operation, and then had support from investors to actually turn it into something. So it was fortunate that I hit the right. I think it was good on timing, identifying the market, seeing where it was, but then it was quite lucky that everything fell into place, and I started buying businesses for £1 million, and then within 3 or 4 years, I was buying businesses for £40 million.
No, this
and
is a really
diversifying into other areas.
And this is it's an important thing about your entrepreneurial journey is that, I mean, for all I know, sort of Brandon Tool Hire, you may have been fascinated by the tools themselves, but it almost didn't matter. Is it true to say that it didn't matter, what the things were, as long as there was you could see a market for it, and then you're talking about boxes and things like that, that actually it doesn't matter if the thing itself is dull, or not everybody's sort of cup of tea or a particular interest. But yeah, go on.
Sorry, and in what do you want to do? I take people through and say, what sort of character are you? Now, if you're quite prudent, you can probably go into a cyclical business where you're going to be, even the good times, you're going to be getting worried. I know that my particular space is business to business services. I like things that can be consolidated. I know I'm not a salesman. I've worked out what my strengths are. And then you can deploy them into other places. And I'm slightly rude in the book about people who say you've got to follow your passion. And I was helped writing this with our great friend Rima Rigby, possibly the prettiest writer, and also a brilliant sort of gonzo business journalist. And and as he said, sort of the reason why there are so many programs about appalling restaurants is because people follow their passion and it's a disaster. So I think you need to stand back, work out what your skill sets are, including looking at what the cycles are. So if you want to start a business or get involved in a business which is at the sort of Wild West early stages, that's all about craziness and nobody knowing the prices, and then it becomes more mature and it's about organise sales, and then it becomes more about financially driven stuff, and ultimately these things turn into cash cows. So it takes everybody through those cycles, and it's people's jobs to sort of go, actually, no, I'm a super salesman. I want to get involved in that space. So I'm not. A lot of people stay in a very similar industry. It's definitely the way to get up the tree. And a lot of businesses start. I quote the example of Rod Aldridge at Capita. He was working in the council office and sort of thought, actually, we should outsource this. And that was if one of those things drops into your lap, grab it. But sometimes it's not quite as easy as that. But I've also supported people of the next generation and said, I've got a couple of mates, my children of mates of mine, who are now running a finance leasing business in the Northwest, having spent both MBAs from London Business School, and I've really enjoyed working with them on. And they've gone, yes, we've always want to run a business, but we haven't got the dream widget in our head, and etc. So I think it's good. And even if you say, right, I want to do that sort of business, why not start off with a business in an adjacent area? Get to know it, and as I say, you're going to get paid. You should be getting paid day one because it's got revenues and sales and customers, and then you're saying, I'm a really good manager. I'm really, at least I think I might be. I've got lots of energy. The previous owner, whether it's a corporate disposing of it or retirement sale, probably might not be up to speed on their AI and things like this. I can really do something in that space. So I'm wary of people who say follow your passion.
Okay, that's really interesting, because a lot of people do say that, of course, as you rightly put out. What about in terms of your own personal, if I'll use that P word, passion for a second, the in terms of your books, Buy, Run, Build. So obviously you've been involved in lots of acquisitions. I mean, is there the thrill of the deal for you? And then when it comes to running the business, is that a thrill as well? In terms of building and growing, is there particularly part of what your role is that you probably love the most?
I think I like what I really enjoy. I mean, I've always enjoyed doing deals because I like meeting entrepreneurs or people running different types of businesses. So I've always enjoyed that. But probably I left Restore in 2019 primarily because I'd run out of ideas. And then in 2020, anyway, it didn't go well. And so I came back 4.5 years later. But and what I've really enjoyed about it is I'm working with the people who I built the business with. A lot of them know so much more about what they do than I know about what they do. And those relationships are just, it's generally about the people. And the thing I probably enjoy most is actually going around our operations. So I make sure I get around all of our sites, well, probably about 120 in the UK. And I make sure I get around, perhaps 100 now, I get around them all, ideally, I'd like to say every 6 months, it's probably every 9 months, and going around them. And rather than sitting in my ivory tower here looking at spreadsheets and wretched PowerPoint presentations of financial results, I just like going around there. And I always feel, when I go around, I feel incredibly proud of what we're doing, and also incredibly humble. I really do. So I really like that part of it. I like the whole thing, to be honest, Trevor. And being a CEO, particularly of a quoted company, you've got to have sleepless nights, but it's just good fun.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we were together on a much, much smaller team, but I always thought that you were very good in the way you handle people, and you sort of came alive when you were meeting sort of, what we'd call stakeholders, if you like, in the magazine. And so that's the moment where you probably feel most alive. I mean, do people, if somebody knew that Charles Skinner, the CEO, is coming to visit their depot or their place of work, I mean, do they know you're going to turn up, or do you arrive unannounced? How does it work?
Yeah, no, I mean, very occasionally I used to arrive unannounced, and sometimes if I'm in the area, I'll pop in. But generally, it's a bit fairer to say, oh, by the way, Charles is in Scotland next week and he's hoping to pop in. But people genuinely like seeing the CEO. They really do. And also if you see that the Aberdeen branch had a really good month, and you can ring them up and go, hi Simon, that was a really good month, and they've met you. That's really good. It's not wrong. People like to see you. I have a very firm eyes on, hands off policy, so I don't get in the way of our divisional MDs and things. But it does give me the opportunity to sniff around a bit, and people really appreciate it. I remember once it was in Inverness and the trains weren't working. And I'd said I'd turn up at this 3-man scanning centre. But when actually no taxis sort of turned up, trudged through the snow, and I was there, they all went, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I said I'd be here. I'm nothing special. My problem is I'm taking up your time when you probably got better things to do than be asked idiot questions by me."
What's the biggest challenge or difficulty you've faced as a CEO that you can tell me about anyway? In terms of challenges. I mean, you've been through some very good times in the book. Obviously, people will find out on buying the book. But is there a particularly knottiest challenge that you faced over all this time?
Yeah, there are many, and disaffected, demotivated people who don't think you're going to make any difference, who are clearly checked out. That's really difficult. And generally you're in an environment there where things aren't right, and trying to get people on board and saying, this is, we can do this. I always used to turn up in one place, that funnily, the original Mavin Wood, and I said, "Hi, I'm from head office to help." And they were quiet for a moment, and then they got the joke. One of the world's biggest lies. That's the really tough one. When I came back into Restore, people really wanted to see me again. We'd had a good time. I knew them. We could all see what hadn't gone right while I was away, and that's great. That having had demotivated people just turning up, going, let's give you more power. Let's give you more responsibility. Here we go. And so that's really nice. But when you turn up, particularly inexperienced, not knowing the people, and you know that their mood is poor, they're looking for other jobs, that's really tough. And how you turn that round. But I think trying to get to demotivated people is really tough, particularly in geographically. Just we had 10,000 people over many sites, and just trying to get hold of the leaders and go, and the middle management and the people on the floor, and go, this isn't as bad as it looks. It's really, really tough.
Have you developed ways of almost turning around people who seem to be unrescuable, if you like, from who were demotivated and so on? Have you managed to do that in certain situations?
Yes, I always divide the three types of people. There are some people who are probably super talented who are just going, this is a shambles, I'm off. And you can go to them and say, you're a top performer, you'll be okay. But they're sort of going, yeah, I heard all that. The second group are a complete pain. They ring you, they say, Charles, I saw you, you haven't got this right, you haven't got that right, do something. And then you have the third group who are sort of going, same old, I'm not going anywhere, it's paying the rent, I'll keep going. And the people you want are in the second group, because they care and they want things to happen. And even though you get your ear bent and you're thinking, blimey, they're pretty high maintenance, they're the people who care, and they're the people who you get on board and say, I'm trying to do this, what should I do? I know you're unhappy about the fact that all our vans are broken down. What do we do to sort it out?
Yeah.
And I'm not dissing any of those three groups, and I think a lot of people fall into the third group and do their job really well and just kind of don't want to know about what else is going on. And a lot of talented people do, when it goes wrong, say, well, I can get, I'd rather go over there before this thing goes under.
And if you can turn around the doubters, I mean, then they become your biggest evangelists in a way, because they were
absolutely
doubters.
And also, quite quickly, if things start working well, you start sweating out the disaffected.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about two aspects of acquisitions, because, a lot of the focus of this podcast is more towards people who have started and grown a business without engaging the world of acquisition. So two questions really on that. One is a technical question. A lot of people probably lack the confidence of finding their way around a balance sheet, understanding what would be a good buy as opposed to a bad buy, and so on. I mean, is there anything you can say to somebody with sort of rudimentary knowledge of finance who might be a bit intimidated by that world, which stops them entering, what could be perfectly good acquisitions? That's the first question. And the second one is that many founders assume that acquisitions are only for large organizations and not necessarily for smaller ones, because it's very often the picture you see through the media and so on. I mean, is there advice you'd give to small businesses? So let's start with the first one, and I'll remind you about the second one if we go off track. And but the first one, about the technical side of things. A lot of people and feel intimidation around not really knowing their way around a balance sheet, for example.
I don't think you need to know your way around a balance sheet in great detail or accounting or anything like that. But most of the people who I've dealt with, the successful entrepreneurs, are commercial. They can say, what's that product? What does it cost to process? How many people have you got doing it? What do you charge for it? And if you haven't got that capability, I think it's, there can be areas, particularly in the creative industries, where that doesn't apply. But most people I know, successful entrepreneurs, and just can sort of work it out in their heads, sales, overhead, that, and then you can be a bit more sophisticated and say sales, what do we pay for the goods, and then what's the overhead? You don't need much more than that. And I think, without banging on too much about the book, there's some really good stuff about the pedestrian nature of this. And the one thing I do say is, when you're selling a business, get an advisor. When you're buying a business, don't imagine that having, whether it's your local accountant or PwC paying them a fortune, don't imagine that's worth anything. Do it yourself. But I don't really bother with balance sheets. You just want to go, what in this business do I like? I like that. And if there's anything which needs sorting out, when you're sorting that out, you've got to understand that you're here for the good bits. So do not spend your life. I've been in too many board meetings where somebody has said, oh yeah, another good month from Wales, move on. And then they go, and of course, the real problem we've got is Penzance. And you sit around and go, oh, Penzance, is it the catchment? Is it our people? What is it? You should go, Penzance, what do we think it is? Okay, fine. Wales, let's talk about Wales. We're doing really well in Wales. It's a very nasty phrase I use, sweat your sweet spots. So the answer is, you shouldn't be too scared of all this type of stuff. And there's a bit of hand-holding in the book for how to do it. And I have, as you expected, forgotten the second question.
I knew it. The second question was all around the assumption that acquisitions are things that only big organisations do. Tell me about that.
Yeah, many of the best deals I've done is buying something small off the receiver, something like that. Which dealing with receivers is another subject, but finding little businesses which you can bolt on, or you can say to somebody, I really like you operating in that area. Could I, are you thinking of retiring? I'm really good. I'm sure I can pay you for it over time. Things like that. So no, I view it as it's not that organic growth is obviously something you've got to focus on the whole time, but quite often there are bits and pieces, and I'm always on the lookout. I always send letters out beginning of the summer holidays and over Christmas to companies which might be very small, but which I think could fit with us. And you send them out then because actually people might be going, might be with the family thinking about things over Christmas. They're going on their summer holiday and they sort of go, oh, God, that weirdo sent me another letter. I wonder whether there's something there. So no, and also I find, particularly where you're buying assured revenue, the risks are much, much less. Where you get into trouble is the sort of investment banker-driven thing saying, I think it's time that ICI bought a vehicle crushing business or something. That is where I see the risks emerging, where it's sort of bigger. People haven't thought through the post-acquisition management stuff. That terrible investment banker who ran a huge amount of things, who had this great speech to CEOs so that he could generate $20 million in things. When the price got too high, or they thought, well, do we really want to do that? He would sit them down and go, dare to be great. that is not a strategically sensible thing that any CEO should do, but they got away with it.
Yeah.
So I don't, and it goes back to the original point that it's buying into a little business, and as I say, I explain how you can do it for very little money, is much more secure than sitting at your kitchen table knowing you've got no income for the first 2 years and having no idea if anybody's going to buy your product.
Okay. Let's do a final plug for the book, Buy, Run, Build, A Guide to Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition. I'd urge everyone to give it a look and hopefully buy it. I mean, what advice would you give to those either starting their first business or looking to buy an existing business? I mean, is there anything that you could say, knowing now what you know that you didn't know when you were starting out all those years ago, when you were, as you said, you were zigzagging around and wasn't sure what exactly what your best strength was? I mean, what advice would you give now for someone starting out or buying a business?
I always start with, have you got secure revenues? So if you're launching a financial PR business, have you got 3 people who are going to, who you've looked after for years, who might not like your parent or whatever, your parent company? Go for guaranteed revenues, because once you've got the guaranteed revenues, I've opened up tool hub branches where I knew that Roger from Gloucester, everybody adored him. They didn't care who he worked for. I knew that the local builders would come in and do business with him. So I always look, first of all, are you comfortable there are going to be revenues and that they're going to be reasonably secure? And that's particularly true if you're buying into a business. If I buy a business off Trevor and he disappears, do all of those his PR clients go, oh, well, Trevor's not here, forget about it. So that's where I start. And then the next thing is find the good people. Hopefully make sure you've got good people there. And particularly if you're in my kind of mold where you've got a decent business brain, you're quite good with people, having people who really know what they're doing in the business, who are passionate about it is really important. But it sounds a bit of a cop-out, but I would start off with, how secure are these revenues?
It was really great catching up with Charles. I mean, Charles very modestly said that his success is all about luck and timing. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I mean, it is about things like that for sure, but also look at the way that Charles talked in that interview about how he managed to turn around people working in his businesses from being unhappy and disengaged to being motivated and on board. Charles is also fascinating on the subject of building businesses through acquisitions. He says you don't need to be an expert on balance sheets to make an acquisition, but you do need to have some kind of commercial instinct and not to just rely on advisors when buying a business. Do your own due diligence. And no, he says, you don't have to be a big organisation with deep pockets at all to buy another business. I know that a surprising number of people in business believe that you do, but actually it's not really true. Other things that stood out for me was one really simple question that Charles asked right at the end for our listeners. How sure are you that you're going to have secure revenues in your business? Sometimes we have a tendency to overcomplicate things, and maybe this simple question from someone who has bought, run and built businesses for most of his career is perhaps the only one that we need. Charles cheerfully admitted in that interview there have been times when he's been dealt a terrible hand and he said played it terribly. But I think over the course of his career he's actually played his hand really well. So thank you to Charles, and thank you to our growing band of listeners and the great feedback that we're getting on the show. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate and review through your usual podcast provider. And if you want to find out more about the Merri-Cast, then look for me, Trevor Meriden, on LinkedIn, or our business Merriborn on merriborn.co.uk. That's about it for today, and until the next time, thanks for listening.